Okay, welcome back to Classical Conversations. It's Wes Schantz and Alex Schmidt, and usually you see us here and we're doing something like a side quest, but before there were side quests, there were the Classical Conversations, and as some of you may know or be wondering, Mr. Wes Schantz and I, we got the same master's degree from St. John's College in Annapolis, which is known for having some great book-style curriculum, and so rather than reading any secondary literature and becoming expert scholars, the notion of the Graduate Institute at St. John's seems to be to educate the cultured young individual or to initiate a young teacher into the wisdom of the primary sources in a way that one might not get at a conventional sort of school, and especially in a conventional sort of educational training program. Having myself a credential in California, I can say the St. John's and the California teaching credentialing agencies have very different approaches to learning. So we thought we might get back to some more classical themes, but if Kiki comes up, because essentially what we're doing here, as you all know, is that we're having genuine conversations with each other, and, well, we talk as we wish to talk, and if you want to listen, then please keep on listening, and if you're interested in us, please say what you have to say. So, Wes, you were saying that you, well, where should we dive in? We were talking a little bit about the kingdom of heaven last time, or last time we spoke, though I don't think we were on air.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was other stuff that we were talking about, but that might be a good place to start. And in a way, it's an endpoint, right? It's a goal, of that towards which. I think you made a post about it on Facebook, which I did eventually get around to reading some of, and I thought it was pretty interesting. It seemed like you were kind of inspired by notes from Underground, but maybe there's a little more going on there as well. So why don't you lay out your kind of insight about the concept, this thing we call heaven?
Right. So I'm just sort of reading through my post here right now, and it looks like So I am now at this point reading through Dostoevsky with the plan of giving a series of lectures on Dostoevsky starting this summer alongside the Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and additional Iliad, Odyssey, Divine Comedy, and Aeneid lectures that I intend to do anyway. And so with another friend who I hope to have on here soon, Mr. Daniel Garcia, we're meeting on Fridays and reading through notes from the Underground. And well, I ran across this quote here, and I'll read from it right here. So far, these are nothing but assumptions on your part. I'll grant you that they conform to the laws of logic, but are they in accordance with human law? In case you think I'm crazy, let me explain. I agree that man is a creative animal, doomed to strive consciously toward a goal, engaged in full-time engineering, as it were, busy building himself roads that lead somewhere, never mind where. And perhaps if he feels like straying now and then, it's just because he's doomed to build this road. Even the man of action, how stupid he may be, must realize from time to time that his road always goes somewhere, and that the main thing is not where it goes, but keeping the well-meaning babe at his engineering chores, thus saving him from the deadly snares of idleness, which, as is well known, is the mother of all vice. There's no disputing that man likes creating and building roads. And then on ellipsis, a couple lines skipped. I wonder if he doesn't like chaos and destruction so much because he's instinctively afraid of reaching the goal he is working for. How do you know, perhaps? He only likes to contemplate it and not to live in it, preferring to leave it when it comes down to it, to animals such as ants, sheep, and such, of course. Ants are different. They have a wonderful everlasting piece of engineering on which to work, the anthill. And so I tied that to the philosophical notion of energeia or entelikeia, as Aristotle puts it forward in his Ethics and his Metaphysics, the idea being energeia being work, from the word ergos, work, and so sort of inner work, or work that comes from inside out, purpose-filled work, where the work is the end in of itself, which is also what the entelikeia literally means, to have the end in itself. And so you as being are doing that which you are meant to do in the moment when you are engaging your entelikeia through your inner geia. And I tied that also to recent work done by Jordan B. Peterson. There's an online article, Meta Traits of the Big Five Differentially Predict Engagement. And even though there's a paywall, you can look at the abstract, and in the abstract, it presents, although initially blah, 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 blah. Okay, these higher order traits have been theorized to relate to individual differences in the functioning of the dopamine and serotonin systems, respectively. As dopamine, and this is what's important, is associated with exploration and incentive-related action, and serotonin with satiety and constraint. This neuropharmacological trait theory has behavioral implications, which we tested in 307 adults by examining the association of a large number of behavioral acts with multi-informant reports of the meta traits. So basically, and I know that was quite a bit to share all at once, the notion is that the kingdom of heaven, as we understand it, at least from a psychological, literary, philosophical, and historical and neuropharmacological standpoint, doesn't seem to be a place at all, but rather more of a mental place in which we are exploring the unknown, or we are activating our incentive reward system in order to move towards a goal which we perceive in the future. And so we experience both hope and a dopamine rush. And so something interesting that Peterson mentions, based on the relationship or the work of Jacques Panksepp, who figured out that rats can giggle hypersonically in a way that we can't hear. How horrifying would a rat laugh be, by the way? But that rats will actually work in order to have dopamine pumped into their bodies in the same way that a human will. So a rat will punch a little button that gives it a dopamine kick until it dies. And, well, what drug do we take that gives us a dopamine kick? That's cocaine. And, well, we'll take that until we die, too. And if you're an alcoholic, that's also what the incentive reward system gets a kick from, alcohol. And so we'll drink until we die as well. And so the notion that I started to play around with there, and even looking, excuse me, above my my computer monitor here, I have a picture of a lonely island with sea between it and me, and with glowing stars above it, and a horizon filled with either dawn or sunset. And it seems to me that the notion of the kingdom of heaven for man is less a physical place, a promised land which we wish to be at, and more a process of going towards the place, the journey, the way, as the Taoists would say it. And I think that that's confirmed, at least philosophically, psychologically, pharmacologically, literarily, and historically at this point. That's a major consilience, I would say. I haven't seen a strong argument against that conception of the kingdom of God, and I could even give literary precedence for that. Odysseus is never happy, even written by Homer, or written by, who is it that writes the Ulysses poem?
Tennyson.
Yes, very good.
Tennyson.
Very good. And Tennyson, Ulysses is not happy alone either. Moses, he never makes it to the city of Jerusalem. He leads, and even though there may be some negative connotation to that, Aeneas, he never gets to the place that he's going with the individuals he leads from Troy. And Jupiter knows that he tries his best, attempting to settle in several different places and having to endure yet a second war. And even Dante too seems to engage with this himself, comparing multiple times his own journey in the celestial spheres to Odysseus's nautical journey, his mad flight, as it were, his demented flight. And so what I'm noticing here, and how this connects to our conversations, is that we talked about sort of drug use in America, violence enacted in schools by individuals, and the lack of, say, meaning that people seem to be experiencing in their lives. And so we've talked about the notion of a collective meaning, not one imposed by a tyrannical or fascist or communist or socialist system or some sort of putrid ideology, but rather a real sense of purpose through an engagement of multiple minds towards a shared ideal. And
Yeah.
Well, recently we've been privately talking, and we've been meaning to publicize these talks. We're not trying to keep things from you listeners. We just don't record everything that we say to each other, even though we feel like we should.
Which is probably for the best. Yeah.
Right. I mean, we'll just, eventually I'm sure we'll have the technology. But the idea seems to be that why people are experiencing such hopelessness now is because it's for a very simple reason, that we're not working together towards a shared ideal, which I think makes less and less sense to us, seeing as we have the most economically robust country that has ever existed. We have the most security, the most and the best healthcare workers ever to have existed, and the most robust set of information and communication-based technologies. We can literally talk to whoever we want, whenever we want, through several different media outlets, and access whatever sort of information from any time that's ever existed at this time. We should have the most stellar humans ever to have existed at this time. And we should be as happy as we've ever been, since we should be even more connected and thus able to work on some sort of super pyramid together. And I think that was something we were talking about too. There seems to be this incorrect notion that if we worked in factories again, we would experience a sort of an indignity or a lack of purpose. Or if we worked in a coal mine, or if we worked on a pyramid, that would be some sort of oppressive force that was subjecting us from outside. Whereas I think if we think of the Dostoevsky quote in the fact that man is not happy without striving towards some end, and yet even the ants have some end to work towards, suggesting that as we are natural creatures, we have some end that we are supposed to be working towards. And that end is often social, since our natural environment is a social environment. And so even creating a pyramid would seem to be something, though not requiring necessarily the most rarefied labor force, at least on the bottom, those who just work, would seem to fill individuals with a sense of purpose, because they wouldn't simply share the shared endeavor, but the story that surrounds the shared endeavor. Effectively, their souls would be part of the pyramid which they were creating, which could be a landmark which inscribes the soul of those people eternally along the spirit of the, or into the face of the world, into the spirit of the world. And that what we as a people, we Westerners, and more specifically people in the United States, seem to need is that shared endeavor towards which to work. And well, that's where we wanted to start today, I think.
Yeah.
There's a nice introduction.
So the thing that a lot of people seem to think of as their project is one of equality, right, and social justice, a project of expanding all those opportunities that you're talking about, expanding them to be accessible to more and more people and more freely. And on the other hand, there also seems to be this project of searching for truth, right? Whether you want to call it scientific endeavor, right? Overall, or sort of all the other kinds of academic endeavors you might think of, or whether you want to think of it in terms of finding that truth which is true for you, right? So that sort of more individualistic.
Right.
And I'm saying this in a pretty broad way. I don't mean to say that these things are mutually exclusive, but I'm just to say that there are sort of these projects out there, and it's like we haven't got quite to the point where we can agree on if there is a project, or if it's all sort of dissipated, you know.
Well, let me speak to that dissipated point, because what I think is that all of what's been happening is an outgrowth of Protestantism. And what do I mean by that? I mean, this is a point that goes back to what Dante has Peter say in Canto 27 of the Paradiso. Paradiso, or Peter, the first pope, starts to glow red with anger and says that his seat, his papal seat, which is then being occupied by Pope Boniface the VIII, who will soon be abducted and then die of shame soon after that, and is Dante's least favorite pope because he has him exiled from Florence. And well, that would make any pope your least favorite pope if he did that to you, I'm sure. Certainly to me. And well, Peter, what he claims is one of the major problems with the church at that time, besides being nepotistic and corrupt, is that they, and giving indulgences, is that they are giving their name to fractionations, to factional-based battles. And in fact, that's why Dante ends up being exiled, because he's part of the white Guelphs who are not backed by the Pope at the time that he's an emissary to the Pope. And so it's the black Guelphs that get backed by the Pope. And so there's a fractionation in the religion even before Protestantism comes along. I mean, there are multiple ones, right? There's the East-West fractionation. There's the fractionation from Islam. And then there's the fractionation into differing orders within the Catholic Church. And then there's the fractionation also within the political parties which represent the Pope and the church at that time. And so what I see with our current attempts is that everybody thinks they're right and nobody is willing to listen to each other. And so that strikes me as a misunderstanding of the sort of Lutheran idea from the beginning of Protestantism, which is that you can have a direct or unmediated experience of the divine, which has been translated into the idea that you can have your own personal subjective truth, which you cannot communicate to somebody and which cannot be wrong, therefore, which means that you are essentially like a divine carrier of truth who cannot be disagreed with and is not expected to articulate his or her thoughts. So you're a super genie being who can't be in any way disagreed with, because that would be offensive to the dignity of the God within you at some point. But the problem with that is that as a liberal democracy, we believe that there's a God within every individual, and that which enables them to use the logos, free speech, to convey information and to understand the information given from others. And the additional problem brought up with that is that if the understanding is that there is something divine within each individual, then that thing which is divine is, and I would say that's the mind and intent and attention, is that which enables you to house and understand the perspectives of other individuals. That's why we play video games, for example, and can read books and stories and do that all day long. We're always exchanging information in a story-like form and catching up with the stories of others, from superficial sort of Twitter or magazine articles all the way down to the most substantial works that exist, like the ones that I teach. And so we're always telling stories, which means, I'm sorry, I'm losing my thought. Wes, whenever I go on one of those tangents, it's always dangerous. The maze is, I need Ariadne's thread.
I think it's like you were saying, that we have the capacity to put ourselves in other people's place.
And so we've come to a point where we have so many different narrative structures and ways of expressing truths that we've stopped believing in truth. And when we've stopped believing in truth, we stop believing in how we express truth and exchange truth and mold truth together in speech. And so now it seems that we are so fractionated that we cannot maintain a conceptual story which houses all of us together, which has a goal towards which we all work. Because for one, we don't have a coherent methodology. For two, we don't accept a divine sort of hierarchy, which enables us to work within a similar dominant structure towards the same goal. And it's made us feel in becoming ever and ever more fractionated, more Luciferian, and that we're all inflated with such pride in the smaller and smaller work we do. It's like Steinbeck says in East of Eden in the beginning, talking about the river that the young people would argue about. And he said it's precisely because it was not a very special river that they argued all the more about how special it was. And that strikes me as the subdisciplines which, say, scholars are trading wide learning for, instead of, say, having wide learning and an understanding of the whole, which would be the duty of a true philosopher and thinker. And is the reason why I would say I'm not pursuing academia right now. They are pursuing understanding of small categories of thinking that happened in the past and then acting like lobbyists to insist that those thinkers should have more time in the limelight, which means more funding for their personal research and more graduate students to push forward their particular political ideals. And now I'm not saying that's what all scholars are doing, but that seems to be the general understanding of what is happening in academia. And it doesn't seem to have much to do with being a jewel through which the light of truth comes in order to increase the amount of light that exists in the world. I would say that's more like what we're doing. This would be real attempts at thinking in the public sphere where we can be criticized, where we don't hide behind ivory gates, ivory dreams, or degrees that mean less and less to everybody involved.
Also, given the sort of sense that there isn't one overarching project, I wonder about um, like the freedom of people to choose the one which speaks to them, and specifically the sense in which, even if it is something that's sort of narrow, or even if it is something which is I don't know, specialized, right? In a way that's harmless, I think, right? As long as you're not sort of shutting down other people's attempts to pursue truth in their own right. And so I don't want to get too sort of like negative about the situation, while still acknowledging that it seems like something is sacrificed when you don't have one overarching sort of project. But I think it might also be sort of like, it's like there isn't a clear opposition, and there hasn't been for a long time. Like, what is the thing that we were in conflict with, which sort of generated that that effort, that shared effort? Like the last time it was really a thing was probably in World War II, or possibly the Cold War. But that's sort of, But so when you're looking like way back at the pyramids or something, I guess in a sense that the conflict is against death, right, or against the fracturing of society or something. But our society now is to the point of sophistication where it's like certain amounts of fracturing are sort of built in and acceptable, and there isn't like one big, well, we hardly talk about death, and there isn't like a big opponent that we're sort of striving against, so
talking about opponents, it seems like if we look at the history even of the 20th century, that the opponent is becoming more and more abstract. I mean, the notion used to be like our tribe versus your tribe, and even the Trojan War was the Achaeans versus the Trojans. But even then, we saw that the tribe became more abstract in that it was becoming closer and closer to a nation, because there were more and more tribes coming together and fighting under a single unified ruler. And from that, we got the notion of the Achaean gods, the coming together and the confluence of the several tribal gods together, showing that together super gods came from that, and those were the Olympians, and that would be how the Olympians were born out from the Titans, the more sophisticated force rather than the natural forces, the forces of nature, like Helios the sun, Hyperion the sky, Gaia, who's more primordial, actually the earth. And so, well, I do want to try and bridge that gap just a little bit, because so World War I was considered the Great War, and so it was a world war, right? It was the first time that it was considered world level forces versus world level forces. And so since it wasn't simply a fight of national identity, it was a fight of world level ideas and what ideals and ideas would rule. And World War II seemed to be very much the same. The Cold War, which came afterwards, seems to have been a slightly more abstracted version of war, in that it was clearly one idea versus another, communism versus capitalism, and who would win out. And well, obviously capitalism won out, because, well, North Korea isn't doing so great, though better in the last week. Of course, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba hasn't done so well. China is becoming more capitalist, though they just elected a president for life, and our president seemed to be okay with that. And so, well, people will probably have opinions about that. But we've yet to ever seen a communist utopia work better than how Dostoevsky describes it, as a crystal palace in which you're not allowed to doubt, because doubt would disprove that the projection of the ideal showed that where you lived was actually perfect, which obviously wouldn't be, because humans live in it, and humans can't indulge in perfection. We know that from The Matrix 2 when we meet the architect who says humans rejected a perfect world. We also know that from the fact that we read stories that have conflicts in them. If we wanted pure harmony, why wouldn't every story simply involve things going well for people and nothing bad ever happening? And even in the Bible and all of our great works, they show conflict. And more, it's like, what is heaven for humans? Oh, I think it's actively and consciously dealing with the conflicts in front of them in their current lives. I think that's what the space of the kingdom of heaven actually is. And when you have humans all working together in order to do that, striving towards a unified ideal, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, for example, you have something like that. And in fact, I would say that's both the basis for a secular kingdom, which shares all the same ideals, as well as a sacred kingdom. In fact, something I teach my students is that, why do we have 50 stars on the flag? And they say, oh, well, stars, those are the states. And I say, yeah, but why are they stars? And they say, well, they're in the blue, that's in the sky. And I say, why are there stars in the skies that represent states? And they're like, oh, well, they're guiding ideals. And I say, yes, that's what a state is. It's a guiding ideal, which we all seem to believe, which guides our action in a unitary fashion so that we can all exist together in a predictable way. And that's also largely what a religion does. So what is it that we have to do moving forward, becoming more and more abstracted and sophisticated in order to pursue that which is the only way that we release dopamine into our systems, which is our best method towards happiness while working together, seeing as even Genesis says that what we have to do in this world is work. And well, it seems, well, I don't know. Do you have any ideas on that, Wes? I mean, I think I have a couple ideas that we could explore, but might as well put the question to you first.
Well, I guess there seems to be a natural inclination to do work. I could see that, but there's, at the same time, there's a definite inclination to not do work. And maybe it's a matter of sort of finding that, efficiency, right? That's within the capitalist system seems to be, if there is such a thing as like a summum bonum, like a final end, a goal, it's like efficiency, right? Like get the most profit from the least investment or something like that, and use the materials that you have to the extent possible, without having to sink too much of your profits in other ways. And I guess the things, well, I was sort of just spacing out and thinking about heaven once you started talking about stars.
Yeah. Share those thoughts.
Yeah, well, I thought about how, the words for heaven and sky are so closely related. And the image that you have of the stars is of perfection until you have the tools and the math and everything to actually notice that they are moving and doing in ways that suggest that they're actually places like our sun, right? And so I think that just sort of connected, that clicked for me with what you're saying about individuals at one time sort of thinking of themselves as the soul, the solipsistic sense of truth, right? My truth is mine and I can't communicate it and you can't know it, and so I can't prove it's right or wrong. But then if you think of everyone as having such a truth, then it's sort of like when you see the heavens and the stars under a more advanced like scientific conception where they're stars just like our star, right? And so then you can start to say things about them and compare them. It's still a matter of, it's up in the air whether we'll ever reach them. And I gotta say, it's, an open question for me whether you can ever really know, the way another person sees the world, right? Who's had a different experience. Like, it just seems
well
difficult.
I would say that I have a beat on what I think would be a good first step. And so maybe when we look at a problem that's this big, going step by step is the most useful way of doing it. And so I have another quote from Dostoevsky, if you'd allow me to read it to you. I assure you that I'll read it in the most interesting fashion, and that it is a most interesting quote. Also from Notes from the Underground. And I give it this title, On the Postmodernists. 2 and 2 do make 4. Nature doesn't ask your advice. She isn't interested in your preferences of whether or not you approve of her laws. You must accept nature as she is, with all the consequences that implies. So a wall is a wall, etc., etc. But good Lord, what do I care about the laws of nature and arithmetic if I have my reasons for disliking them? Including the one about 2 and 2 making 4. Of course, I won't be able to breach this wall with my head if I'm not strong enough. I mean, smart enough, by the way. But I don't have to accept a stone wall just because it's there, and I don't have the strength to breach it. And so I would say that that notion is very much what I see becoming more and more prevalent, that we are suggesting that we have our own truths out of a resentful desire to be special and not like the rest of those around us, because precisely that which is supposed to differentiate us within a competent, structured society is our competence and endeavors, which can merit us, which can enable us to make a living not only in a moral and ethical way through helping out and working towards the good, but in an economic and self-sustaining way, which is also a moral good according to Kant, being self-sufficient, as well as a fairly strong Protestant ideal. And the Protestant work ethic is generally, as a term, thrown around as one of the keys to American and German success in the world. And you can do whatever you want with that claim, but that's something said and therefore very interesting. And so the idea seems to be that we wish to create this solipsistic, this self-serving truth that we serve precisely in order to make it so that we do not have to, in our incompetent ways, defend our lack of competency. It seems that instead of engaging in a logical conversation in which we, like wrestlers, wrestle against each other and improve and strengthen ourselves and further define ourselves and our goals and our ideals and the methods towards which we wish to strive towards these goals and the reasons underlying why we strive towards these goals, we're instead trying to hide in a dark sort of fog. And the problem with hiding in such a dark sort of fog or in our own sub-disciplines as scholars, if we think we're being perfectly fine, sort of like you might, perhaps even somebody who lives under a fascist, totalitarian, or socialist regime and simply minds his or her own business, is that actively doing wrong? Or is that a sin of omission that might also be evil, just as evil, or on the same level as a sin of commission? Hard to say. Jordan B. Peterson seems to think most of the sins that we commit during the day are those of omission. So probably a bigger deal than we like to think. And so the problem is that we're leaving ourselves in the dark wood, which Dante finds himself in the beginning of the Inferno. And the problem with that dark wood is it's full of resentment, deceit, and arrogance, and lacks the self-motivation, lacks motivation, lacks a force moving one forwards towards something that he or she has faith is good and hopes will enable the future to be better than the present. And so the only way we bring about a future that's better than the present ever, and this is a Hindu as well as a Western idea, is that we have to actively plan a better future that we then attempt to implement and deal with the obstacles that occur along the way, and that gives us a great story to embody in the world. And that only by having a cross large enough that uses all of our strength and will and conscious intent can we mitigate the tragedy and the pure suffering and pain that underlies our existence within the world. And I would say that lacking that cross is precisely why we see so many Americans these days, especially middle America, who have recently lost their jobs and potentially their trades and careers, resorting to opiates. Because what does an opiate treat? Pain symptoms. And where do pain symptoms come? Depression. And what often causes depression? Real problems in the world. And what's a major problem that causes pain symptoms? Well, that would be the depression that comes from feeling useless because you don't have a job and therefore have lost the structure that binds your life together, as well as the goal and the community that gives story to your life and therefore purpose and meaning to your days. And of course, the drug is just a poor substitute for that. And I would say that that's why in the Odyssey, the second obstacle that Odysseus encounters is the Lotus Eaters, he and his men, and that's right after they've won a war. And so the first difficulty they encounter after being victorious champions is the turn towards nihilism and the forgetting of their own homecomings and the forgetting why to exist, because since they've just achieved something major, they may very well have forgotten that, well, the next step isn't just to give up or to die, sort of like how Frodo goes off to the what are they called, the White Islands, after his great endeavor in the Lord of the Rings. But well, the terrible thing. Yeah.
Are you saying that Frodo's going off is a kind of capitulation? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Sam stays in the world. Sam stays in the world, whereas Frodo has to because Frodo has endured something too difficult, a trauma, you might say, too big for him to remain in the world. And so the trauma that Odysseus and his men have to deal with is that they won, and now they have to readapt to the world because they continue to live in it, which is surely a major difficulty for our current troops too, who so often encounter PTSD in their own lives. I mean, just imagine how your map of reality changes when you go from, say, middle of Kansas to, say, the Middle East and an active war zone, and then returning back here again, totally changed. And so that's fairly incredible. Yes.
I can sort of imagine that. I'm not sure that I can imagine that, honestly. Like, I think, well, I can imagine it better, like you're saying, right? If I see like some data about it and I talk to these people and we do the work of unpacking some of whatever burdens and stuff that they've dealt with, right? And set it in a context and get some kind of science behind it, and or hear about their religious beliefs or lack thereof or whatever. So there's sort of like this triangulation of truth. But I just I don't think it's ever going to be possible to sort of like ultimately satisfied. But maybe this is just another way of saying what you're saying about heaven, right? Like, the ideal situation is not to perfect all knowledge, but to, in some sense, create or recognize a goal worth striving for and put in the work, right?
And to continually adapt it to the changing demands of the world and to improve our aim and our ability to aim as we continue to do it. So
So I guess my next question, I mean, like, one thing it seems like most people can agree on, although they have very different ways of couching it and different ideas about how to fix it, it seems like most people can agree that the system of education is not working very well, that there's, very big problems with public education, but there's equally, significant problems with trying to imagine alternatives, right? They don't seem fair, they don't seem just. And maybe this is just because we work in schools, this is sort of our wheelhouse, but that's like, looking at the work that's out there to do, that's sort of what appealed to me, at least, was like, okay, well, working in schools seems like the thing to do. But it's tricky to try to get an umbrella or like a tent, that to fit all of education underneath of, and to kind of like get people to actually all sort of work towards a goal, like to make it more specific than improve education, right? Like,
yeah, well, one thing I can give you a different answer from what you may have heard before from fellow educators. My goal as an educator, in order to prove education, is to be as stellar a thinker as possible, and to use all the incredible resources that we have at our fingertips in this generation, and our abilities to live lives in which we can actually indulge in thought at a higher level than ever possible and share it in a more widely distributable way than possible. I intend to be as excellent as I possibly can as an educator, and to create as many materials as possible and as good a way as possible with as high an intention as possible, in order to help guide young people and old people alike towards that which will improve not only the society around them, but their own lives within it. Because I think that we are ultimately puzzle pieces nested within something larger than we are, which we cannot possibly understand, which is a point Dante makes about the justice of the divine, suggesting that if you are a puzzle piece, or say a tree in the forest, can you possibly understand how the dynamics of all the forests and all the interrelations that create it? And it's like, obviously not. I can't even understand the inner workings of myself, whether I'm a tree or a human. Either way, I'd be too complex. Perhaps if I were a human thinking about a tree, but even that'd be pretty complex for me at this point. And so rather than waiting for a social policy or waiting for somebody else to get off their butt to do something, I think that putting out educational materials that are better than the ones that I've seen in the past, that I had access to, at least during my credentialing program, and making access to the finest works of literature and philosophy that exist in both the past and present. I think that at least is how I can start to help the deficiencies that we see in the modern education system. I think that rather than focusing on the deficiencies of the modern education system, I like to think, how could I help to educate people today? Or how could I educate people better? Or how can I teach what it is that I actually know? Returning to Plato, because recall, the big point that Plato makes while the sophists are coming about, the sophists being very similar to the postmodernists in that they value words over truth, was that why would we listen to a sophist in a political assembly where we're talking about shipbuilding? Why not talk to a shipbuilder? Why would we talk to, a sophist about a strategy for war? We would talk to a general. And so why would we talk to a sophist about an issue of truth? We should talk to, someone who understands the truth in perspective, someone who's like a teacher or a philosopher, or someone who would belong in the sphere of the sun in Dante's Paradiso. And that would be someone like me or you, someone who is a teacher in the field and so understands the truth of the craft through both experience and understanding, and thus covers Aristotle's both common and noble ways of understanding things. And so basically, I think the competent people who understand the fields they're in need to both work and popularize their work through speaking. And then they need to speak to each other as we speak to each other in order to craft an understanding of the proper aim that we can share together. And then perhaps others around us will explore that because they want to explore it themselves. I mean, something you said in your podcast, which is very kind about my podcast, was that if you listen, perhaps you will be inspired to start your own. So watch out. And that's precisely the point. In pursuing my entelikeia right now, I'm hoping that other people pursue their entelikeia. And I think that I see that in you, not that I'm in any way responsible for that, but that I think when we all shine the lights, however dim they may be, in the darkness, that we show people that they can shine their own, and that regardless of how dark or misplaced it happens to be, that it has great value. And that's precisely what people seem to be forgetting, that their decisions and their worth have tremendous value, that everything it is that they do has some effect on not only the world, and not only themselves, but the world in which they live, the social fabric in which they exercise themselves. And so rather than thinking that we live a hopeless existence in a place that's polarized and has no meaning and things could get better, but we don't believe in the word better, though we certainly believe in worse because we don't like how worse feels and we're constantly saying things are getting worse and we're not doing anything about it. Perhaps each one of us could say, like Bill Belichick says to his players, the Patriots, do our job. And what our job is, perhaps we have to figure that out each for ourselves, and there is not and we shouldn't just rely on some system or some government or some person outside of us to tell us. Not that we would want that anyway. Isn't that part of being in a free society, that we get to choose what it is we want? Even if we are bound by some sort of destiny, you can choose to live up to it or not. I teach that in every single book I teach. Achilles, most recently in the Iliad. Though his destiny will make him preeminent above others, he still fights with himself about whether he's going to live up to it or not, in the same way that we all fight with ourselves. And no pill or system or person is going to be able to fight that fight for you. I think personal responsibility is going to be a strong part, and just responsibility itself as the counterweight to rights, and taking responsibility for the world in which we want to live and fighting to make that world a reality is going to be a big part of what we as a generation do moving forward. And perhaps we are going to have to articulate what that world looks like, but that's precisely what we have to do: articulate, debate, and manifest the world that we want around us. Because if we just wait around for what the world is going to be, waiting for Godot, well, we've seen what the result for that is. What do those men do at the end of waiting for Godot? They commit suicide because of the meaninglessness of their existence. Let's consider that option Z. And let's say we don't want to do that. We don't want to destroy ourselves out of the pointlessness of being. Let's assume that's not only a bad way of living while we live, but a bad outcome to life as well. And let's pursue the opposite, a life full of meaning and purpose in which we seek to articulate what it is that we want for the world. And let's put as a criterion for that which we wish to articulate and make in the world that it be the highest possible good that we can possibly envision, implement, and agree on. And let's spend all of our time trying to figure out what that is.
I think that, that speaks to pretty much anyone who's dissatisfied with their current situation. But it's like a lot of work,
Yes.
So
Yeah. Well, what else is there to do? What else is there to do, honestly speaking? It's
right.
like the moment that we stop working towards some sort of ideal, we don't get that dopamine kick from the incentive reward system. We start becoming depressed and manifest pain symptoms. We might as well understand that when Genesis says that what man's punishment is that he has to work once he becomes conscious and self-conscious. It's like, well, yeah, insofar as you're a conscious and self-conscious creature, which we all are, which is part of the fact that you get subjected to laws, the understanding is that you have to be a free creature which has a consciousness in order to be subject to laws. That's the idea. Or we call you crazy and we send you to an institution. Or, since we de-institutionalized a lot of mental illness, send you to the street, unfortunately. I believe San Francisco, I read an article recently, 55% of the people on the street there have some sort of mental illness, which that seems to be where a lot of the mentally ill ended up going, even though they had to live under terrible conditions because of the fight between who was paying for mental illness facilities in the middle of the 20th century, the state, and then the federal government, and then the state again. But yeah, so it's a lot of work, of course. Peterson says, clean your room. And the reason why he says that is interesting because what's underlying that idea is that once you set the habit, even once you set the pattern of attempting to arrange your life in a more meaningful or efficient or effective way, then you set a pattern which you then try to abstract and implement across your life. And so that helps you to set an attitude of setting yourself towards the good, towards the ideal. And what I would say about that is that, in Auschwitz, one of the punishments they would give to the inmates there is that they would have them carry 100-pound soaking wet sacks from one end of the city-like structure to the other, much like CrossFit does now, but with totally evil intentions, even more evil than CrossFit, not to make light of it. And then the guards would make the people put the bags down and pick them back up and walk them back across. And so the notion that comes from that Nietzsche says is that you can endure any how if you have a why. And so what it strikes me is that right now we're all living in the how. We all have to work and suffer. And in fact, life has more suffering insofar as we don't have a why because we just focus on the pain of existence rather than the reason for the pain, which is noble, which makes existence worth enduring, which raises us up. And so the moment when we start to focus and aim towards something which is true or better, then the pain will start to dissipate and nobility will start to seize our beings. And each person will be able to find a place within that ideal because there's no amount of there's no limiting factor on how much good you can do regardless of your personal competency. If you aim towards the good and lack competency, you can still add to the good in the same way, though perhaps with differing levels of results than somebody with extraordinary competency. And in fact, just like with yoga and martial arts, do you have to be flexible to start yoga, or does yoga help you to develop flexibility? Do you have to know really cool moves to start martial arts, or do martial arts help you to develop the capacity to move your body in new ways? Do you have to be strong to start CrossFit, or does CrossFit help you become strong or powerlifting? It's like, do you have to be really good at doing good things before you start aiming at the good, or do you just have to aim at the good and perhaps you start improving as you practice, like with all things? And so, sure, it seems like a lot of work, but it seems like the alternative is a lot of work and pain, whereas this is a lot of work and pain, but for a reason that makes your life matter. And if we are limited beings that only exist for so much of amount of time, regardless of whether there's some heaven or afterlife or not, that which we leave in this world is our personal legend, the inscription on the world soul that we live through becoming as defined and differentiated and individualized as we possibly can, so that the thought that's left in the world is as unique as the actions which we brought into it. And that would mean that our lives are works of art that can be defined in relation to our goal, skill, and the amount of effort that we put into it. And so if the goal of life is to differentiate yourself to such a degree that you can effectively say that your life has been a work of art that is completely unique in its manifestation in the world, then you have done something which will enable other people to do good things for the rest of time, insofar as we value it and keep it. And that doesn't sound so bad.
And it doesn't say, and it really doesn't say anything about the existence or non-existence of some kind of metaphysical heaven of perfection and eternity and all that stuff, which seems like, you know, it's like the thing that people's minds tends to go to.
Right, nor is it prejudice, because even in Dante's Sphere of Jupiter, he has 6 just rulers in the eye of the eagle that speaks for all just rulers. 2 of them are Jewish, 2 of them are Christian, 2 of them are pagan. And what does that say? Well, that the person who can live the just or fair life, or the person who can know the fairness of the divine, or at least implement in the world, it doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter what their race, religion, or identity or self-perception is. It matters how they embody fairness. And that's something that any human can do. And in fact, there's an old Kung Fu master quote, which is 2 hands, 2 feet, which means people are very much the same everywhere you go, with minor differences which very much do differentiate them. But the vast majority of what we are, both physically and metaphysically, is very much similar. And we should be focusing on those similarities, precisely because that helps us to highlight what the real differences are, what the values of the differences are, and how we can use the differences in order to sharpen our ideas of what we actually believe and wish, and how we wish to live is. I think that's precisely the conversation that we can be having right now, and that we should be having, rather than arrogantly assuming at the beginning that we understand the terms that other people use and that we can then write them off as lacking information to acquire to us. Perhaps we should treat them as having human dignity, and therefore knowing something and housing a perspective that we don't out of hand have the right to just discount, but the fact of the matter is, it's to our own detriment to discount the perspective of another person, insofar as they have information which we lack, which could then be shared in order to increase the power of our perspective, which then makes our map better, makes our map of the world better, and therefore enables us to act more intelligently and effectively within the world. It's like we just act against our own interests when we don't listen to the people around us. And it's completely stupid, idiotic, and we need to stop doing it.
So that made me think about the image of the School of Athens again, right? You've got the 2 in the middle who've sort of, again, to put broad strokes on it, right? Plato pointing up, he's like heaven up there. Aristotle pointing down, heaven here, you know, like do things here. But they're talking to each other is the main thing, right?
Yes.
And they're surrounded by this constellation of thinkers who are in various kinds of conversation, looking over each other's shoulder, trying to find out what that person knows about, disagreeing about things. But so I guess if you tried to paint a school of whatever, New York or London or wherever it was, you know, it wouldn't look like that today. It'd be like people on their phones, you know, or
disagreeing with each other too. See, that's the big difference. So in the School of Athens, I'm glad you brought that up, because we've been talking about that. Plato's holding Timaeus, which is a work on cosmology, the heavens, and Aristotle's holding a work, the ethics. And the idea is that the law of the heavens can be applied to the law of earth, and therefore the law of the heavens, which is based on proportionality, can be applied to ethics, which is also based on proportionality. And so Plato is sort of God the Father, and then Aristotle's sort of God the Son there. And then the person who knows the law of heaven then teaches it to the son, or the disciple, who then embodies it in the world, which would be Aristotle's ethics. And so all the characters around them are either talking to each other or reading or writing or looking at the heavens and writing. And so they're all expressing the truth which they understand, either learning the truth of some other genius. And it shows the great conversation of the great Homeric chain, essentially, right? The great conversation between all geniuses and the respect that they have for each other. And that respect that the geniuses have for each other in creating the culture which the School of Athens then represents, and which we have all inherited, well, that's how those individuals who are considered the wisest ever to have existed interact with each other. Perhaps we should take a hint And we should also learn from the wisdom, not only of the past, but of our brothers and sisters around us now. And rather than looking at each other's Twitter feed, seeing one word that seems to be misspoken or out of line, and then attempting like a troll, which is named for a subterranean creature which lives under a bridge and fails to reveal itself due to its nebulous and disgusting existence, just like a person who acts like a troll because they don't have a truth or a goal towards which to aim, rather than a demonic one like the Malebranche near the bottom of Dante's hell, which is of course where they seem to be living, their mother's basements. Well, it just seems that there's something much better that one can spend one's time and energy doing, in pursuing understanding the information that those around us can give. And so to return to my point, the geniuses in the School of Athens are all communicating with each other and sharing that which they know and refining not only who they are and what they have to write, but the culture which they are adding and subtracting to, which they're burning away dead wood from, and helping to institute new, interesting pieces of cultural edifice into. And so if one of the most beautiful paintings that we have ever understood shows precisely masters and students interacting with each other and sharing the information flow, then perhaps what it is that we're supposed to do, given the fact that we have unadulterated access to each other in several different media through several different devices at seemingly all times during the day, perhaps what we're trying to tell to ourselves is that we don't want to be closed off from each other, but rather we would like to actually share real communicative information with each other, rather than sort of bags of hot air like Aeolus's bag of wind, which Odysseus's men foolishly opened just to see how little is there. And I mean, the reason that we have the capacity to speech is not simply to nitpick at each other and to demonize each other, but rather to share in something greater than what we are. And it seems that those are the only options, though how we implement them has infinite variety. And well, I would already say that shifting my ideals has already shifted the behaviors in my life, the expectations, and the very trajectory towards which I'm aiming. I mean, we're 40 podcasts in now, and regardless of the quality and the number of viewers at this point, we are doing something. We are offering our voices to the world. There is some bravery in speaking to the 10 or so people who listen. And that's better than saying nothing to the no people who would be listening if we had nothing to say, and perhaps developing resentful thoughts and wishing to do something mean-spirited, low, crude, or violent to the world around us in order to make it pay for the weight of our existence. We're picking something up, weak as we may be, and we're doing something. And so we're providing an example. This is how we steer our ship. Perhaps other people will like to steer their ships as well. Perhaps we can make an armada. Perhaps then we can conquer some new frontier, which would, I imagine, be an abstract frontier. And perhaps the new frontier, the final frontier, is not space, but that which is called space in Dante's Paradiso, and it's human consciousness in the mind, and how best to optimize ourselves in order to optimize the living situations in which we exist in a collective fashion. How do we be the best possible individuals in order to create the best possible society around us, so as to enjoy both differentiation and unity all at once, to experience the delights of plurality, as well as the shared focus and happiness which comes with sharing an ideal and working towards it with those around us. And I would say that literally speaking, it will make us happier because we'll be able to predict the behavior and of those around us in a better way, as well as have long range predictive outcomes for us as a people. We'll be able to extend ourselves into the future even better, the better we can predict each other's behavior around us. The more stable we are, the more we can envision a future. And in fact, that's something that's supposed to be a great virtue of America right now. The Chinese like to buy our property because they understand that in 20 years they'll still own that property because there won't be a major regime change here. And so stability based on trust seems to be the most tremendous national resource possible. And that trust comes from being able to predict those around us. And the best way to predict behavior of those around us is to have a shared ideal towards which we're all working. So it's in all of our best interests to work together. Because when it's in our best interest, we're going to work in that way. When it's not, that's when we have some issues. That's when we have some issues. Um,
Well, it's that, but it's also, I mean, I think you pointed out rightly that maybe a bigger issue and a bigger point on which people can agree there is a problem but disagree about what to do about the problem, like, yeah, mental illness, like what do you even define that as? And then all the people who haven't even got any kind of property, right? They have nothing, right? Whether they're homeless or whether they're just, living in their parents' basement, or it takes many forms, right? But there's a diagnosable and potentially treatable kind of icky thing going on, well, so if that's the case, like, are those two things uh are those two things related, right? Like, does a school um nowadays have to contend with these other needs, these basic needs which are not being met, whether they're mental health, whether they're shelter, uh, whether they're a lack, sort of a lack of motivation, right? Because these are all things that in schools, students do have access to food, students do have access to a nurse. Most schools don't have a psychologist on site, but maybe they will soon, or it's sort of like the direction it seems like we're headed.
I don't think increasing amenities is going to solve the problem. The fact of the
Yeah.
matter is that when the ideal isn't set in a correct way, that nothing will ever be the proper solution except for setting the proper ideal. It's sort of like how when you're with the right person, you'll make it work regardless of their flaws. Whereas when you're with the wrong person, regardless of what goes right, you can't do anything but focus on the flaws. I think the idea is that we think that if we offer more and more services and give people more and more rights, that they'll be healthier and healthier and freer. But we seem to be getting sicker and sicker the more we focus on rights and privileges and forget about what a responsibility is. And so instead of, say, sending newsletters home to parents, giving them scientific facts about the fact that, say, step children are abused 100 times more than children to natural parents. And also there's objective data that children from single parent families not only do worse than students from dual parent families, but they also tend to make that an intergenerational gap. They tend to also be single parents that then extend those deficiencies to their families in the same way that you would expect a pattern to repeat, not only across an individual life, but through multiple generations. And so sharing those sorts of facts would help people to understand that they, as parents, have an individual duty to their students. And part of that duty is to make them as responsible as possible so that they can help as much in society as possible so that they can garner as large a wage as possible, because that's very much a reality in somebody's life. And so perhaps focusing on developing skills and having some sense of social responsibility will help mitigate not only the suffering of life, but will help to reorient our focus less towards additional privileges and coddling and more towards developing stronger characters and people capable of dealing with the difficulties and the anomalies which present themselves in their existences. So instead of making people safer, making them stronger. And so, very early on in the podcast, I said that was sort of my issue with a safe space. That a safe space is a space in which it can't exist, because a safe space is simply an abstraction of the idea of a society, and you already exist within a society, so you already exist within the safest space possible. And B, a safe space can't exist where there's an information flow or a conversation occurring, because any information that I give you that's anomalous, depending on how neurotic you are, may indicate may induce anxiety or fear in you, which you could then define as being a threat, and therefore define me as a threat for teaching you something new about the world. And that's my job as a teacher, is to teach people about new things in the world that are potentially threatening. And so the very notion that would not be welcome in a safe space shows me just how ridiculous and stupid the notion of a safe space actually is. It's a space in which you leave people who are going to be eaten by a bear whenever the bear feels like eating them. I would prefer to teach you to use the spear you have so that you have a chance of fighting against that bear. But that's my duty as a teacher, rather than some blathering idiot who just tells you nonsense that makes you feel good and doesn't have to worry about the consequences of that. Naturally, my life's work has to do with the the character and the souls of the individuals which I inscribe my mind upon and form the minds of every day. And well, I tell them that their intellect is a sword and that they need to develop it as well as possible. And that in Harry Potter, clearly the wand, which is individualized to the wizard is their intellect, and out from which spells come, which means they use their words to indicate their magical power, just as we use our words to indicate our magical power, which is our ability to think and our ability to make distinctions about what is real. And so developing a mind is very much a real thing, but is also the personal responsibility of each individual who exists within a democracy, because that's what their vote means. Their vote means this is what I think, and this is how I believe, and this is how I act based on that belief. And so perhaps if we start to actually teach students, mold students, help them to produce skills, and we help to educate not only them and their parents about their social and civic responsibilities, some of the load that's put on teachers and the schools currently will start to lessen as we realize that the ship of the state requires everybody to row at their oar to whatever ability, with whatever ability and competency they have, rather than there be like sort of a Pareto distribution in which there are a few people rowing very hard and then a lot of people sitting in the back resentfully thinking that the person's rowing the most and putting the most effort in are in some way oppressing them. I mean, that's just utterly ridiculous. It's like, even if we were more successful than we are, which we aren't, would we be oppressing people by freely putting new content onto YouTube, which is effectively full of the thoughts which are our life's work up to this point? Or is that simply an altruistic thing that we choose to do, giving our time and our intelligence to those both present and future? I mean, I think we're offering the example here too. Instead of sitting around and waiting who's going to fix things, start to fix those things around you, and you will already be doing the right thing and doing quite a bit in order to improve your aim and the aim of the society around you. I think a big idea is to understand that society is just an abstraction of the individual. If we want society to work better, we have to work better as individuals. Especially if we don't want somebody coming down and telling us what it is that we should be doing and why we should be living and how we should be doing it, which I think as Americans who value freedom and justice for all, as the pledge says, that's not exactly our bag. I think the old idea is that we want as little government as possible in order to live as free a life as possible. And especially living out west as we both do, I think that idea is still very much alive and well. And I see a lot of merit in it, frankly speaking. So rather than treating the government as if it's some sort of kind of benevolent God that can effectively work in a way like Zeus throwing a thunderbolt, which means immediately on the world, we should perhaps understand the federal government as a giant nonsense machine that works as inefficiently as any giant bureaucracy would work, and that the best solutions to our practical problems in our current situation and our current surroundings is going to come from us, because we're people, we know the situation, and we know how to fix things to some extent. And so we shouldn't just wait. That's the wrong solution. Waiting for somebody else to get working. That would be my answer to that.
All right.
I know, quite a long answer. Didn't even say anything about Kiki.
No, not tonight.
Not tonight.
Yeah. Let's see. I have tomorrow off. Like, I don't have to go to school tomorrow, but I don't know. You want to try to talk about Kiki before too long?
Yeah, tomorrow might work. We're still recording, but I always like, I thought we might share this afterwards. So this is sort of our sort of epilogue, I guess. And so for the listeners listening, I decided, and I think we sort of decided, because some of our best stuff is just when we're talking to each other. And so might as well keep the mic on. So yeah, so sometime like tomorrow or like a Tuesday, I think I'm still going to try and convince Daniel to get involved. And then we can talk a little bit more about the Russian literature and connections to the New and Old Testament, and some connections to what's going on right now and how we might work effectively in order to fix things. Because an idea that I recently read from Peterson is that essentially what a story is an abstraction of a codified set of behaviors which have been repeated so many times in a culture that they're then capable of being expressed in language and precisely through story. And so the idea is that a myth as a codified version of such a story is the past, present, and future version of a story. And so we can embody such a story. And the point of keeping a myth, even from the distant past, is that it has some truth that we can embody in the present, preserve, and then transmit to the next generation. And so that's something I'm very interested in exploring and seeing connections between the New Testament, Fyodor Dostoevsky's work, the current psychological work of Jordan B. Peterson, and just what we personally are doing as educators in this time. It seems as if there's always a major fight. There's always an apocalypse coming, something that's going to be revealed. There's always something towards which we work, which is coming in no time flat. And so we don't want to live a nostalgic lifestyle where we're simply longing for the past, but rather one in which we're constantly in fear of what the future is going to bring, because we're working hastily in order to bring about the best future possible, and we're working against the clock because, well, something's coming. And, well, we need to make what it is we're making and before it gets here. Or we need to make what it is we're making in order for it to get here. Seems more likely. No more waiting for Godot or waiting for God, but using that which we've been given, which is our consciousness and our ability to transform the potential, which is what we interact with in reality into actuality. Which means let's make things better around here. No more complaining. Let's get in the fight, like Theodore Roosevelt says. Get in the arena, endure the critics, make good things. Looks like your cat's a little more interesting than I am, which I don't blame. There are delights that cats offer that I do not.
Yeah, they might be ready for dinner or something.
Well, so might we all. So might we all.
Yeah.
Well, Wes, I've had a great time speaking to you. This has been a wonderful conversation. And shall we leave it here and till next week?
Yeah, well, let me know what plans you come up with as far as Underground Man. But then, Kiki, sometime soon before I forget everything I thought about Kiki.
Okay, yeah, either tomorrow or Tuesday. We can make it happen. I don't want to forget it all too, because there's some good fresh stuff, and I don't want to try and push it like we did with Spirit Away on the second time. We got to be able to show what's flowing, and I'm still having a little trouble with the video. It's not the same as when I'm on radio and I can just sort of like look up into the heavens. I have to focus on sort of looking into the camera. I can't get too far away. I can't walk around. And so I'm still adjusting quite a bit. And so listeners, I'm sorry that I'm still adjusting. I'm still improving. I'm still trying to get as good as I can get for all of you, and to be as good as I can be. But I am still adjusting. I'm consciously adjusting. I'm attempting to improve.
My sense is that the video is always more sort of focused somehow. And yet going along with that is a sense of like, retreading or sort of like circling around something, but I don't know. Yeah,
we don't flow exactly as well as when I can just look at your thoughts.
Right.
There's something sort of about being able to close my eyes and just look wherever and focus on what it is you're saying. It helps me to factor out more additional details, which enable me to focus on your thinking better. Like even just closing my eyes in order to articulate that in as sophisticated and precise way as possible. I close my eyes precisely so that I don't have as much sense data coming in, so that I can get to the limit of my abilities and express myself as perfectly or as precisely as I can at this current moment. And so there's some element of that missing from face-to-face, but I suppose we're going to have to do it face-to-face. And, we're just going to have to. And I'm going to have to get better at focusing on what has most value, what has highest value, or having these conversations.
Yeah.
I can't wait to hear your third installment of the podcast. Just something as a little taste for the viewers is that just as there's a buzz at the beginning of Earthbound, So is there a bee at the very beginning of Kiki's delivery service? She just sees a little bee, kind of shows it off, and very interesting. It's if a bee is a symbol of life's work and how it manifests, very interesting as a symbol for both Ness and Kiki as they both disembark or embark onto their life's work from the beginning, when they're both given their major opportunities and see a moment which changes their lives forever, or begin the initiatory journey which will lead them from being children to taking their place in the adult world in a now differentiated but socially appropriate way.
Yeah.
Well, since it's Sunday and tomorrow's Monday, maybe that's the note we end on. Get a good night's rest so that you can add your individual contribution to that which we all contribute to in our socially appropriate way. Oh, there's another cat. Well,
that's good. Till next time.
As usual, Wes, it was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.